On our channel, we have already analyzed the lives of a European king and a peasant, a Russian Tsar and a serf, a Roman emperor and an ordinary Roman. The life of a pharaoh we also have already analyzed, but we have not yet had an ordinary Egyptian laborer as a guest. It's not right. Today we will correct this misunderstanding. What did the inhabitants of ancient Egypt eat? What kind of outfits were in fashion? And how they spent their leisure time? You will learn in the next couple of minutes. First, let's clarify this point. Which ancient Egypt we are going to talk about? It is still more than 2,500 years of history. Could not the way of life of local people remain unchanged all this time? No, of course. But looking ahead, we note that the way of life of the most common laborers here changed the least of all. Power, religion, language have changed, but some of the ways of life are still alive here through the millennia. Specifically in this video, we will talk about ancient Egypt of the New Kingdom era, about 3,200 years ago, as this period is the most studied in terms of the life of ordinary people. So, the name of our guest today is Khenker-Khepshef in the 13th century BC, and he lives in the city of Thebes, then the capital of Egypt, known today as Luxor. The name Khenker-Khepshef is not taken from the ceiling. It is the name of a real Egyptian of that time, the found diaries of which are one of the most important artifacts for historians. Khenker-Khepshef, let's just call him Ken for short, grew up in a neighborhood on the edge of the capital with his parents. His father
taught my son in wisdom, and as a young man you must study diligently or you will be a failure as an adult.
Ken was a commoner by birth, but at his father's insistence he learned to be a fox and received an excellent education. He was very fortunate, and in this way he rose up the social ladder. For literate people were worth their weight in gold at that time. Only military officers, priests, officials, and the pharaoh himself were above them. Lower in the pyramid of social hierarchy were hired laborers, pyramid builders and soldiers, then artisans like cooks, potters and weavers, free peasants, and at the very bottom slaves and prisoners of war. In addition to education, Egyptians valued one more thing: family. It was of great importance in life. Marriage could be concluded from the age of 12 or 15 and very often by calculation. There were also incestuous marriages, which were not only not forbidden, but also very popular, particularly among the pharaohs and nobility, to preserve the purity of the family. How popular they were with the common people is unknown, but Ken was not. He was lucky enough to marry a girl from his own village for love, and she was also literate. We know this because of the preserved love letters that the lovebirds wrote to each other. This is important to realize. Egyptian society was quite progressive in this regard. Women had the same legal rights as men. They had the right to dispose of their property, to bring up their children, and even divorce. A record of that era has been preserved, which reads, "Love your wife as you should, make her heart happy as long as you live." However, the roles within the family were classically distributed. The man was the provider, and the woman was the keeper of the hearth. Society, by the way, was also quite close-knit. When Ken and his wife were married, the whole community gathered to help them build their new home. The houses were built of mud bricks with straw added. The dwellings were relatively large, as the walls were up to half a meter thick. This was done to keep them cool during the day and warm at night. Windows for the same purpose were small, under the very ceiling. The roof was flat, as rain was rare in this climate. People took advantage of this and could sleep under the open sky on hot summer nights. There are no forests in this area, so there is very little wooden furniture in the house. It was mostly made of the same sandstone or reeds. An important part of the house was a special stove for baking wheat bread, which formed the basis of the average Egyptian's diet, including Ken. The caring wife baked wheat cakes every day and gave them to her husband to take with him to work. Each housewife had her own bun recipes. Sometimes they could even organize cooking competitions among themselves. This phenomenon can be found even in modern Egypt. Getting up at dawn in the morning, Ken and his wife would do the morning toilet. Hygiene was also highly regarded among the Egyptians. Commoners washed in river water. More noble people could afford a bath. The pharaohs loved milk baths. They were believed to keep the skin young. Mouths were rinsed with salt water, and instead of soap, they used suap paste made of animal fat, ash, and chalk. Basically, the ancestor of our soap. After ablution, men and women shaved their bodies and their heads, on which a wig was placed. People who could not afford a wig simply cut their hair short. Long hair in this climate was a real torture. By the way, the wigs were of strict geometric shape and resembled a helmet, and women's wigs were longer and consisted of many plaits. Wigs were made by special artisans from human hair, wool, or just ropes and impregnated with oils. After shaving, people groomed their nails, spritzed themselves with perfume, and applied makeup to their faces. Black or green eyeliner was a must. It was applied by both women and men. It was not only aesthetically pleasing but also very useful as it protected from the bright sun, dust, and inflammation. It is also used by modern athletes like baseball or soccer players. This makeup was so important that there were even special servants who went around and corrected it for workers during the day to keep them focused on their work. The clothing of the Egyptians was extremely simple. It could not be otherwise in such a climate. Ordinary laborers often went about naked or wore loincloths. Other people wore simple-shaped dresses or skirts cinched with a leather strap. The lighter the fabric, the more expensive it was. The most expensive and sought-after material was linen, and the most unpopular was sheep's wool. They walked either barefoot or in sandals. The very costume of Egyptians of different classes did not differ practically in anything, except the quality and material of fabric. Absolutely everyone tried to decorate the dress with some ornament. Noble people could decorate the dress with gold threads. Everyone wore jewelry and talismans and amulets. Noble people made of precious metals and stones, and commoners made of pottery and glass. It doesn't matter what they were made of. The main thing is not to leave the house without a talisman, to save you from evil forces. After finishing his morning ritual, Ken goes to work. He has become a fox, just as he had dreamed, and he is working on the construction of another tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Ken keeps records of the progress of the work. Thanks to these records, we know a lot about this part of life. Workers' wages were usually paid in the form of shelter and food, not money. And in principle, the concept of money was not so popular at that time. There was natural exchange. Even taxes could be paid in grain, for example. Ken's list of no-shows for work was also preserved. Some guy didn't show up because he was stung by a scorpion, and another guy was out with friends. Do you think he got fired? Another guy canceled because he was involved in the mummification of a relative. That's a good reason for the time, so no complaints about him. In addition to his reports, Ken complained about his boss and his nagging, but he wrote, "Don't go against your boss's orders. As long as you are a subordinate to your boss's word, you are a law unto yourself." Finally, it's time for lunch break. Stepping back into the shade, Ken pulls out his wife's neatly folded lunch. Some things really haven't changed, have they? Today's lunch is bread and onions and beer. Beer has been around since we were kids. The wealthier people could afford wine. Egyptian beer and bread are not at all what we are used to seeing in supermarkets today. Bread flatbreads are very fatty and caloric. They were also often eaten with vegetables. Meat was more often eaten on holidays, as it was very expensive. Beer was also very different from what we have now. They drank it for two reasons, and intoxication was not one of them. First, water was not and could not be stored back then. In standing water, microorganisms quickly developed, leading to dysentery. And secondly, Egyptian beer was very thick and caloric, so much so that you could even eat it. By the way, these ancient recipes of beer and bread still live in Egypt. If you are there, be sure to try the lunch of the ancient builder of the pyramids. In the hours of rest between jobs, as well as in the evening, people had a lot of options for pastime. Children liked to play ball, wrestling. They had a lot of different toys, such as modern volleyballs, as well as animal figures and dolls. Rich people loved hunting and boating on the Nile, and ordinary people had a whole bunch of board games. To our days, exactly preserved games. Senet to our days, mehen and dogs and jackals. Senet is very similar to modern chess. All these games have preserved boards with pieces and rules, so we can also play them over a beer and a flatbread and feel like a real Egyptian living 200 years ago. The Egyptians were into magic and mysticism. We said earlier that everyone carried amulets. Ken had a dream book in his personal library. He used it to interpret his dreams and try to use it to guide his life. He was also fond of astrology and tried to practice magic, which may have made him notorious among the locals. Nevertheless, modern Egyptologists characterize Ken first of all as a highly educated and very inquisitive person who apparently tried to collect knowledge and preserve it for posterity. This is by no means the only known such case, which shows that the Egyptians highly valued the tradition of passing on accumulated knowledge to descendants. This happened both individually, as in Ken's case, and in a more organized fashion. The pharaohs had their own libraries and a vast array of painted walls on which were inscribed histories, calendars, and many other pieces of information to be preserved for the next centuries. Ken lived a long life and died at the age of 70, 43 of which he had worked as a fox in the Valley of the Kings, and in doing so had taken a position as an official. Thanks to this, he could afford not just a decent mummification but a separate tomb with his wife in the same valley where he worked. Mummification meant a lot to the Egyptians because without it people could not enter the afterlife. Wealthy people, like our Ken, could afford a full-fledged rite with the removal of internal organs and placement in a sarcophagus. People poorer did without removal of internal organs, but very poor people were buried in mass graves with whole families where they were mummified naturally. At the end, also debunk one myth. Ancient Egyptians were not at all so absorbed in thoughts of death as is now commonly thought. On the contrary, they thought only of life. Even death for them meant only a transition to the next stage of life. They were concerned only with the right transition to this very life. By the way, there were plenty of atheists too. For example, there is a poem by a bard who mocked this rite, saying,
"Not a single dead person has ever taken with him anything that was left for him in the tomb."
Such, surprisingly progressive for their time, were the people who lived more than 3,000 years ago. Some aspects of their life were so productive that they still live on the territory of modern Egypt, and some aspects like women's rights were safely forgotten and reinvented only in modern times. If our chatter was to your liking, then rate this video and write in the comments your ideas for the next videos. See you again, friends.